All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Priya Chaya, and I am the Associate Director of Content at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Welcome to our first webinar of the year, New Year, New Perspectives. If you're joining us in the chat, feel free to introduce yourself as someone has already started and let us know where in the country you are joining us from. I am outside Washington, D.C. in Alexandria, Virginia. In case you don't know, Preservation Leadership Forum is the professional membership program of the National Trust. This webinar series is made possible by members of Preservation Leadership Forum, and we're really thankful and grateful for those of you who are here today. Today's webinar is a roundtable discussion with new leaders of local, state, and national preservation organizations, focusing on new trends in the field, the role of preservation nonprofits, and the vision of the future for preservation. But before we get started, here are a few technical logistics for you. We'll take questions from the audience during the webinar. Please make sure to send them using the Q&A panel that is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We won't be accepting questions that are submitted through the chat, so just make sure to use the Q&A panel. The closed captioning function is enabled for this webinar. And then following the program, we'll send out a recording of the webinar directly to the email that you used to register, along with any links or additional information that we mentioned we will share during the session. Our panelists today represent organizations from the National Preservation Partners Network. So I'm going to hand this over to Samantha Bosshart, the chairperson of NPPN, to tell us a little bit more about that organization.
Thank you so much. I'm greeting you guys from sunny Palm Beach, Florida, and I'm so happy to be a part of this. We're so fortunate that everybody who's going to be on this call is a member of the National Preservation Partners Network. And for some of you, you may not be familiar with that organization, but we are a membership-based nonprofit dedicated to strengthening the capacity of our partner organizations and the collective historic preservation movement. And we do that with training, network, knowledge sharing, technical assistance, and in-person convenings. And in fact, we will be having a convening at towards the end of June in Arizona. So I hope that you will consider signing up for our newsletter and learning more about us and potentially visiting us in Arizona. We have several affinity groups. These are held typically quarterly, and those include affinity groups for leaders across the country to gather and talk about different topics or how they are related to one another. So we have an affinity group for big cities, local organizations, fundraising development, new executive directors, like some of the people that we are going to hear from today, programs and education, rural preservation, as well as easements. So again, great opportunity to learn from other people in the field and what they're doing, what's working, what's not, and what issues everybody's facing. Last but not least, we are actually looking for our new executive director at the Partners Network. So if you're interested in learning more about the partners and or interested in this great job opportunity to really take the organization in its next chapter, which we're excited about, please visit prespartners.org. So I'm going to turn it over to Adrian Scott Pham with the LA Conservancy.
Thanks, Samantha. I really appreciate that, and nice to see you. And I echo everything Samantha just said. NPPN is really a fantastic organization. So if you're not a part of it already, please consider joining and being part of the larger network of preservation nonprofits out there. So again, hi, I'm Adrian Scott Pham. I am the president and CEO for the Los Angeles Conservancy, and happy to be here. Our goal today is relatively simple. We want to have an informal roundtable conversation. And what we're going to strive to do, and I'll ask my fellow panelists to please go ahead and add your cameras and voices, but we want to have a candid, diverse perspective conversation. We're going to talk about how our work is evolving, also how we're responding to changing conditions, and also what we're most excited about in these new roles. So including myself, we have 4 nonprofit organizations and leaders who are all relatively new in their positions, yet we all come to this work through different directions, different lived experiences, and different work sectors as well. And also that we all are not the same in terms of nonprofit historic preservation organizations. There's lots of different types and flavors, and also types of constituents that we need to respond to. But to give you some kind of comparison, contrast of the 4 organizations that we have here today in this conversation, this is sort of a breakdown. We have organizations that were established in 1956, 1978, 1987, and 2007. All of us are advocacy and education based, but in different ways. We have rural, urban, West Coast, and East Coast perspectives. We have annual operating budgets ranging from between $250,000 a year to $3 million. We have a citywide, a countywide, a statewide, and a national organization. And we have staff sizes ranging from 3 persons up to 17 persons. And lastly, we have memberships ranging from 200 persons up to 4,500 persons. So clearly we are not all the same, but in my experience, and I think my fellow cohorts here will probably share, that we have very similar circumstances and challenges and things that we're dealing with depending on what size organization we are, or our focus in terms of what we do. But let's go ahead and get started. And first, welcome everybody. Happy you're here. Let me start asking you all, my fellow folks here on the panel, by sharing a little bit of background on yourself, how long you've been in this position, and most importantly, why you wanted to take on this leadership role for a nonprofit. So maybe we'll start. How about Marisa? Do you want to start?
Sure. Nice to see everyone. Thanks for being here today, and thanks for the invitation to be with you. I'm in Providence, Rhode Island, which is the traditional homelands of the Narragansett and the Wampanoag peoples. I joined Providence Preservation Society in mid-October, so I've only been with the organization for a few months, but have been longtime collaborators with the organization. Saw that the former executive director is with us today, and that's wonderful. And I had partnered with Brent and with a lot of the staff for years. I was at Brown just a few blocks away for years. And for me, this sort of transition point, I came really out of academic practices into preservation work. I'd been working on preservation and heritage from outside, and a lot of what compels me to do the work overlaps directly with issues of social justice and equity. And I think for me, it felt like this organization and also the broader field was at a point where those issues were becoming much more central to the work as opposed to sort of marginal and peripheral. And so I think as that kind of eclipse happened, it felt to me like a really good time to get to kind of be in practice and try to make some of the changes in a city that I'm committed to and really love.
Jenny, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Adrian. Hi, everybody. My name is Jenny Buddenborg. I'm Executive Director of Preserve Montana. And I've been in that position now for 9 months tomorrow. So tomorrow is my 9-month anniversary. I've worked in historic preservation for 20 years now, primarily in advocacy, but I took a little bit of a break to work for local government with the City and County of Denver for 5 years as a preservation planner and developing an adaptive reuse program for the city. And I'll be honest, I wasn't sure that I wanted to be a nonprofit executive director. I worked for the National Trust Denver field office for 11 years, and I worked alongside and with a lot of nonprofits across the country and especially the American West. And I saw, how difficult the position can be. But then I effectively started serving as an unpaid executive director for a growing nonprofit in Colorado as I was serving as board president. And I kind of caught the bug for the position. I learned that I wasn't half bad at it. I liked the work. It was very multifaceted, challenging, fulfilling, and the impacts were just really incredible. And working alongside some really wonderful people was really, really fulfilling. Preserve Montana has been around for 35 years now. I'm only the second executive director that the organization has ever had. So the opportunities to grow the organization, to diversify its programs and outcomes for the benefit of people and communities across Montana is really vast. And to lead that type of work is incredibly exciting. It's also really daunting. But it's exciting. And the people here are great too. I would say that, one of the big draws for me to the position was the staff, the board members, the partners. To be able to work alongside these folks to do the good work that Preserve Montana does is really quite exciting.
Thanks, Jenny. How about we?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Adrian. My name is Pham. I'm the Executive Director for Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, or API-HIP for short. I'm based out here in Seattle, Washington, but our staff as of earlier this week is bi-coastal now with another in Virginia and another peer in Washington as well. And I've transitioned from my role as a board member to Executive Director of API-HIP exactly 5 months ago today. And so I actually took on this role because I was encouraged to do so by my mentors, my colleagues, other board members in the field. As a relatively young member of this cohort, I think if my peers had told me to wait 3 or 6 more years to get more experience, like I would have listened to them. So it really speaks to kind of looking to senior leadership, to giving trust to the next generation of preservation practitioners and leaders. And I look forward to bringing in my intercultural, interdisciplinary, and multi-generational perspectives to the work. And I follow a long lineage of leaders for API-HIP, including Dr. Michelle McGawlong, who served in my role as a volunteer executive director position for nearly a decade. And so there's those transitions that is really strong and really at the front of my mind when I'm doing the work on a daily operation level.
Thanks, Wade. And then I will I'll respond as well. So again, I'm Adrian Scott Fine, and I am the newest of the group here. I've been in my position a month with the Los Angeles Conservancy as the president and CEO. However, I've been with the organization for about 13 years, previously directing our advocacy efforts. And we are a citywide, but certainly a countywide organization. So we have 88 cities plus the county that we cover, about 4,000 square miles. So it's a large area in terms of the organization. I can relate a little bit to what Jenny said. I also was with the National Trust for about the same time that Jenny was, in a different part of the country, and worked with lots of nonprofit organizations. And I've seen how hard running a nonprofit actually is. But I also, through my time at the Conservancy, I've grown to love this organization. I love Los Angeles, Greater Los Angeles, and the work that we do and the places that we get to protect and save. And it was an opportunity, and I really care about where I want to see this organization go, and working closely with our board and staff to make things happen. So that's been a big part of why I wanted to step into this role. And I think it's just an exciting time in preservation in general, in terms of the field is changing, we're evolving, and I think there's a great opportunity as well as a challenge for us at the nonprofit sector to really make a meaningful difference. And I think that really leads into maybe the first question I would like to kick off with us as a conversation. With the idea that preservation is changing, what are you most excited, to tackle in this relatively new role in an organization that it's not brand new? We've been around for a while, all of us, in terms of our work. But what do you want to change or evolve into in terms of the work that you're focusing on or taking on? So I'm not going to point to anybody specific, but if you want to just go ahead and start chiming in.
I can jump in with this one.
Sure.
I think with API-HIP, we always apply a Asian Pacific Islander lens to some of the larger topics that preservationists are talking across the board and across the country, right? So like when we're thinking about how affordable housing is related to historic preservation, a lot of the conversations and campaigns that communities across the country are approaching API-HIP for are like displacement issues in Chinatowns and our ethnic enclaves. If we're talking about climate response, a lot of our communities or historic neighborhoods are built along coastlines and waterways. And then thinking of the wildfires of Maui last year that is still trying to recover from. And then emerging histories, when we're thinking about like mid-century modern is historic now, or architecture of the 70s or 80s are reaching their 50-year mark. we're thinking about the same with the Southeast Asian migration wave in post-fall of Saigon, as Hmong, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laos are coming to America through the 70s and 80s, and are we prepared to recognize those histories at a regulatory level with National Register, or even at a community preservation understanding of like, these are the places that we have migrated to and we are still here today? How do we recognize our contributions and our presence?
I can jump in. Mine might sound a little drier, but I am most excited about building new tools, incentives, and policies in historic preservation to address all those amazing topics, that Hui just shared. Coming off of working at the local level, I really feel like that's where the rubber hits the road with preservation. Local organizations, Adrian, like the work you do with LA Conservancy, there can be so much impact there. I think a lot of our tools, our incentives, and our policies are dated. And I know there's been a lot of emphasis to improve upon those. But to have those in our pockets to do the work that we want to do, to really touch upon those greater issues, I think is really key, especially as our societies are changing. And to me, I always think of the work that we do in advocacy as a way to empower people, right? Like, we are here as nonprofit organizations to empower people and organizations to advocate for historic preservation. So having those tools and policies and incentives is a really important thing. And I don't know if this will come off well or not, but I want to make historic preservation common. Like, it's not an extra, it's not a burden, it just is. It's a common thread of everyday life, with clearly understood benefits. And I think in some areas that's understood a little bit better than others. But always at kind of the crux of what I do is, how can we get to everybody to help them understand what historic preservation is, and that it is there to be beneficial. And there are all these wonderful things that come of it. So I think that's where I'm seeing sort of the evolution in how Preserve Montana, which I see as a very resourceful organization, we've been pretty successful at doing projects and doing them well, and getting our hands dirty. And I can see us doing more of that moving forward.
I don't think it comes across off or anything in terms of saying common. I think it's also another way of saying what increasingly we're having a conversation about, is ensuring the work that we're doing is relevant and connecting to the things that people care about, which are a lot of what you were talking about, and I think certainly Jenny too, is that's the shift that I'm seeing in terms of our work that we're doing. And that's, for me, probably the one thing that I find the most exciting, because you can just see the people that traditionally have been left off, both in traditional forms in terms of places that we've recognized or designated or even included, but also the people that we're connecting with that traditionally didn't think preservation was for them or a part of their community. So the more that we do that, that's really gratifying, to have those connections with community members that traditionally, haven't been with us. And I think, the work that, it's happening in so many different ways with, the way we're talking about preservation in different ways, like NAPC with their messaging guide. Cindy, I think you're on the call, which is great in terms of thinking about how we communicate better around preservation, or what Bonnie's doing with the relevancy guidebook in Landmark, Illinois. I mean, there's just some really good things I think are exciting in terms of this field right now.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think, in some ways I come at this work as an historian and someone whose work and interests are really interdisciplinary. So for me, when I think about preservation, I sort of see it in a constellation of practices, all about, that relate to public memory, the landscape, how we how questions of power really shape the landscape, both in terms of architecture, the design of the landscape, what we value, preservation. So, ultimately it's really about making choices and deciding what has value and how we define value. So I think what I'm really excited about is an opportunity to be doing this work at a time where there's increasingly kind of openness to acknowledging gaps in archives, missing stories. And so the ability to kind of be doing this at a time where there is that acknowledgement, I think there's a lot of energy to try to widen all of the stories that are told. So there's that, I think, that's happening. And then there's also, and this isn't just preservation work, but we're sort of all working at a time where these kind of community connections are really frayed. So the potential for preservation, heritage, cultural organizations to be places that build community and build some of those networks through the work we do, for me, is something that is really sort of inspires my work. And then Jenny, to your point too, I think there's a lot of policy work, especially I think coalitions to be built with environmentalists, with thinking about sustainability, how preservationists and people who are really focused on climate change can work together. There's sort of a whole world of policy and work to be done, I think, with new coalitions that hopefully can shape some of those outcomes too, that I think are really unfortunately there, but also exciting to be able to maybe be part of some solutions.
So I'm curious, since we're all relatively new in our positions, and I'm guessing there are probably others joining us that may be new or contemplating jumping into the nonprofit ED role. I'm curious, did any of our predecessors leave you with helpful advice? Of course they did, but any good advice that you want to pass on, or that now that you've been in your position for a little while, that you think is worth sharing?
I don't know if there was specific advice so much, but I guess I would share that my board has really provided me with a great deal of freedom and flexibility to make this executive director position my own, which is really wonderful. I think with any transition of this type, especially, so my predecessor was in the position for about 21 years. And as I'd mentioned, was the very first executive director, and I'm the second. There have been some growing pains as we all kind of get up to speed and understand personalities and all that kind of stuff. And that's, very normal given the circumstances. But I would just say that given my 9 months in the position so far, that, really having open and frequent conversations with board members, staff, and stakeholders, of course, is key, like no surprise there. The one thing too is exercising patience, which is not one of my strongest suits. Hopefully you guys do a little bit better there, but it takes time to establish yourself in a new identity for an organization. So just having some patience and doing that, I think is really key.
Yeah, I think a lot about patience too, Jenny, where I think some of the pressure or expectations, whether it's self-imposed or otherwise, to perform, to do, and to get active with your new role, right? And so I'm very fortunate to have my predecessor stay on an official capacity as a senior advisor, so that there is like a direct contact, and recognizing that, we have different skill sets, we have different relationships in the field, but the thing that bonds us together to carry on the legacy of API HIP's work is that intense care for our communities, our audiences, and our partners that make the sum of API HIP, right? It's not just the board, it's not just staff, it's not just people who sign on our newsletter, but like the people that the mission represents, and making sure that we have intense care over their history, their heritage, their resources, and making sure that we empower them through historic preservation in the right direction.
Well, my predecessor is here today and is also a dear friend. And I said this at something else when I first started the job 3 months ago, but I continue to text him often and reach out to him. So it's wonderful actually to have the former ED stay in the same city and also be a friend and be so available. And I think the surprise coming in for me, having known this organization as a collaborator, a partner, is the intense responsibility that so many people come with expectations, that Providence Preservation Society has deep, deep expertise in so many, more fields than we have staff people. So there's sort of an expectation of deep expertise running up against questions of resources and how many people are on staff. And so I feel that sort of tension, and also the responsibility really of that expectation within what is actually a very small organization.
And I can also share that one piece of advice that has definitely come true just in a month is that there will be lots of people that come forward with lots of ideas about what you should be doing as an organization in this new position. And so that's already happened. And so I think that's part of the balancing act, which leads me to, I think the next piece of conversation I think it'd be worthwhile to kind of chew on a little bit is this idea of how do we balance the reactive, which is kind of inherent to the work that we do, with the proactive, and also understanding the issues that we're dealing with, from housing to climate change to whatever. So I'm just curious how you're thinking about, or how are you already tackling that in terms of your new role in your organization?
I can go first because I don't have the answer.
Yeah.
So that just puts more pressure on Hui and Jenny to have an answer on that one. I mean, if that is a question I am asking lots and lots of people. So that's a question that I have been asking, past executive directors. We have many people who are in Providence who have been involved with this organization for decades. And then we have a lot of new people who have come into the organization who see different things, and they have come in for different reasons. So I mean, that's the kind of question that I'm asking and trying to assess. And of course, that comes back always to this question of resources. And I think the only other thing I'd throw into that, as I myself don't really have an answer yet, and I'm really struggling with that challenge, is we often we humans prioritize what is visible in some ways. And so whether that means, saving a building as opposed to doing policy work that isn't quite as visible, we all tend to privilege the visual over some of those things that are harder to see. And so wanting to also unpack that a little bit, understand when impact doesn't necessarily mean saving a place, but when do we still show up if there's no hope of saving a place, because we show up for our partners, because they've shown up for us. So there's a lot of complexity to that question, which I'm going to pass the bar off to Jenny and Hui, who are going to now give a wise answer, but I'm still very much struggling with that question.
For me, I see some of the proactive things that I think when we got the draft of the questions, it was kind of split between like advocacy and educational outreach program work. And so the way I've been thinking about it, since you've asked that question, I haven't articulated it before in my own mind, but I think that when my organization invest in educational and outreach opportunities, which we would call proactive, right? It's not something that we're responding to. We think of it as an investment towards the advocacy work that we would have to do later, right? So like if we're introducing a general public to a historic site or to a heritage tradition, and they see it through a historic preservation lens, when that building is up for sale or has a demolition permit on it 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later, there's still a grounded community around this. It's like, oh yeah, like I thought about how this place is important to my community or to my heritage. We can apply some of these things that we learned a while ago to this, rather than like there's nobody cares about this building. There's no community around it. We put a petition out, we put a letter of support out, nobody signs on to it. We have to do the teeth pulling work of educating them from the ground up about why this building is important or why this historic site is important, right? And so any of that educational, introductory outreach, or some might even call fun work at the beginning, I try to frame it as an investment towards easier advocacy work later on. And so that's kind of my justification when it feels like, oh, I gotta, focus so much on this emerging problem that needs high level support right now. Or it's like, well, let's not forsake some of our general public audience building, next generation kind of outreach work as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a balancing act. I would say every day I feel like I go through a triage, of what needs to be tackled. But I think Marisa and Hui, say it very well. There are a lot of different ways that I think we are doing proactive preservation work. Maybe we're just not acknowledging it enough. The partnerships we're building, the outreach and the education that we're doing, that's all laying a really important framework so that when some big issue pops up, we're ready to tackle it, where we need to be in that more reactive mode. So yeah, maybe part of it is just us, recognizing that and celebrating that work a little bit more and saying we have been pretty proactive. At Preserve Montana, I will say we do have a program that I think is really quite proactive. We have built up a restoration and training program, which is our largest program right now, that consists of skilled craftspeople who actually go out and do rehabilitation maintenance work on historic properties across the state. So in that way, we are, proactively saving properties. They're not necessarily endangered. They may just need maintenance. They may need some work, to keep them up to snuff. And as part of that, we also do workshops too, to train anybody who's interested in learning about, shingle roofing replacement or historic window repair, so that they then can take those skills to their home or wherever else if they want to turn it into a profession. And we're also hoping to build a core, preservation core, which will allow students to work over a several week period of time on a number of historic properties across Montana and help rehabilitate and save them through preservation carpentry skills. So I know a lot of different nonprofits and preservation organizations are also focusing on that work too, even through, revolving property programs, investing in property development. So those are also ways that I think proactivity is happening in the preservation world.
Yeah, I guess in asking the question, I'd be curious your thoughts on this, but I mean, I always equate sort of education and advocacy as one and the same. They're just different approaches to getting to the same end result. And there is a proactive and reactive nature to both of those components. But part of it is like being more intentional in our work versus just having to deal with the thing that comes in at us where we have very little control to try to manipulate it, because we're not in control of the situation. And I think in the circumstances where we are sort of planting a seed on an issue, maybe a big issue, early on, it's led to good things down the road, which is sort of the awareness building, appreciation, understanding that this heritage or these places have value, that when they're at risk, will be a better situation down the road. We've done that around legacy businesses, and we've done that around modernism from 1960s to 1970s architecture. And this year and next year, we'll be really focusing on the housing issue around where is the nexus between preservation and housing, and where do we provide strategic value, and how do we help in this very complicated, big issue, especially in a place like Los Angeles. But I think the more we do that, we also hit the target of being, are we relevant? Or asking the question, is the work that we're doing, is it relevant to the people in our community or the constituents that we serve as a nonprofit organization? So I guess that's another way of looking at that same question about, are we, how do we balance all these kinds of things at the same time? So can I throw out another topic? And I'll just, a one word, fundraising. Who loves it? Who can't get enough of it already in their new position? And who was afraid of it going into this new role? Because it's inherently a key function of any nonprofit leader's position is to fundraise. So I'm just curious more about, like, what's your experience been with that as you started down this path? No one's willing to jump into this. That's maybe telling.
Yeah, I think where am I in the spectrum? In the middle, like, fundraising is fine. It's probably not, I'm not most excited about it, but of course, that's sort of a lot of the job. I mean, I think when I think about it, even just in the past 3 months, what I have found that's really great about this organization I inherited is that there's a real diversity of programs and themes that that PPS works on. And so Jenny, to your point, we also have a young building trades program that has both a workforce intensive and a do-it-yourself sort of segment of classes. Even in doing that, if you have a diversity of the kinds of activities you're doing, what I found is that leads to obviously a diversity of the potential people who connect with that work and find it meaningful. So that's one thing that I think I have found is it's a question partially of, because, the fundraising in a sense is really like a partnership. And so in an ideal situation, you're doing a thing that a partner is already really invested in, and you find each other and through kind of the support that they can give to these programs, they're also getting something out of it. But the question is, in some ways, how many different kinds, do you have enough different kinds of programs that you can be actively engaging people who have different priorities, especially today where climate, of course, is a priority for a lot of people who are giving, and so is direct service. And so sort of thinking about how an organization, a preservation organization, can be doing some of that work, and then also kind of working in partnership with donors and individuals and foundations who have made those their giving priorities, is kind of the key.
Yeah, for us, I've been trying to think about the mantra of like, you miss the shots that you don't take. And with staff capacity and effort to reward ratio in mind, you have to have the belief that there are funds and funders out there that want to support your mission, right? And so I think you can't be a pessimist, and you can barely be a realist while working in nonprofit work, right? Like, you have to hold a little bit of optimism to, one, for your mission that, a better world is out there, and two, that there are people waiting to fund you. You got to find them, and to move that forward. Otherwise, it's just a downward spiral, right? Or you're losing too much program time to do fundraising time, and that there's that fine balance, and that goes back to like that effort to reward ratio.
Yeah, I don't mind fundraising. And it comes in a lot of different ways, right? Shapes and forms. I mean, you could do grant writing to, raise funds. You can do individual asks, of donors and foundations, sponsorships. Earned income is actually a fair portion of our budget, which is also helpful. And I would say that, and this may go without saying, that having a diversified revenue stream for a nonprofit is really important. And one of the things that me and my board have been really thinking about is sustainable fundraising, really looking to build an endowment, that actually is giving us some pretty good return moving forward, because it is difficult to find those unrestricted funds. When you have great programming and projects that you're working on, it's relatively easy. If you can tell that compelling story and share that and make that sales pitch, then you can find those funds relatively easily. But when that project or program moves on and you still need funding to, keep the organization going, finding those other revenue streams or those unrestricted revenue streams is really important. So, yeah, I think Wei was kind of getting to this. If you don't ask, you don't know. I mean, that's kind of, I think, a main element of fundraising is you just got to make that ask and see if, you can interest people. But there's lots of different ways of doing that. One thing we're also investigating too is our membership program. And I know this has been an ongoing conversation for a lot of nonprofits, how you should frame a membership program. Should you have a membership program? And we've been considering that at Preserve Montana too. And right now, we are an advocacy organization, as all of you are here on the panel here today, and many people, in the audience. And membership brings that really important constituency when you are advocating, to be able to lean on that number of people and those people to really advocate for a given issue. So for us, membership makes sense. But I would love to see and learn more about maybe some creative and innovative membership programs that are out there that can help with that fundraising and revenue stream. And also continue to build that really critical support for the organization on an advocacy front.
Yeah, I think that's a critical question. I think a lot of nonprofits are facing right now. It's about the membership and if that's sustainable long term, in terms of maybe where you had a membership level at one point, can you keep it at that same level? I think it's also a question of maybe younger generation doesn't necessarily prescribe the idea of being a member. They like to support an organization and support specific programs or events, but they don't really want to be a member necessarily. They don't see the same value in that maybe someone else, maybe of a different generation might have looked at that model. We as an organization have we fluctuate, but we're around 4,500 members. And at times we've been much larger in terms of our size. But that's a critical mass, both from a revenue, but also certainly support that we hopefully can mobilize when we need, but at least to educate and communicate with in terms of pressing issues and needs in our community. So it's important to us. It's also a connection in terms of our work. And many of those people have been members with us from the very beginning. So it's a really critical piece to that. But I'd be curious if others are reevaluating or rethinking kind of membership model since you bring that up, Jenny.
Yeah, for API HIP, we don't have a membership model, but we're considering it, and we're trying to make it meaningful, relevant, and up to date with, as Adrian alluded to, next generation membership or engagement, or even older generations, like if they are opting out or if they are putting their resources and attention in different avenues, like how do we address those? So it's definitely in our consideration as our development plan for the next few months, but we don't have one yet. But it's very attractive since a lot of other preservation organizations do have that, but they range in success rate, right?
Yeah, I'm finding coming in, our membership rates stay amazingly the same, which is, both you want to see it grow a little bit more, but also, to be honest, given what everyone has been through over the last few years, a lot of organizations have really lost people. So I think Providence Preservation Society absolutely hasn't. Our membership is quite loyal. And in some ways, when I think about the things that I'm more worried about or more focused on, it's for us right now, it's not membership for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. It may also be the longevity of the institution and how connected generations now feel to it. I mean, we have members who literally their parents were members and were involved. And so there's just a very deep kind of personal connection that a lot of people have to the organization. And I think that has helped sustain the membership.
We're almost at that time where I think we can take some questions from the audience. So I would encourage you again, everyone, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A function. And there's a couple really, I think, some meaty questions that we can chew on a little bit here. And I'm going to go with one from Vince Michael. Hi, Vince. Nice to see you. Well, I can't see you, but nice to hear from you in terms of a question. But he's asking about the question, have we bumped up against organizational culture that resists modernization or maybe change and wants to keep doing things the way we've always done it? Just be curious, certainly probably more so for you all than myself that have been at the helm a little bit longer to be able to answer that question.
I mean, I can say that with my board right now, I think we're really excited to see some change for the organization. As I'd mentioned, the predecessor had been with Preserve Montana for 20 years, and here's an opportunity to kind of do a refresh, right? And I think we have some things that have worked really well for the organization, but we also have some opportunities to have new programs, new projects, new vision moving forward. So I haven't really run into that issue too much where somebody doesn't want to really make a change. They want things to kind of stay the same. If I'm understanding the question correctly, I think Preserve Montana is really in a position to re-envision its work and its relevancy in Montana and how that might contribute nationally.
Yeah, I think at PPS, 2021, a new strategic plan was adopted that is really powerful. It's pretty much why I came to the organization. It is sort of strongly on the side of taking a new look at preservation's history, at questions of equity, at questions of inclusivity. The language is pretty strong. I think so I am, it's why I'm with PPS, but all to say in some ways, the challenge, some of the pushback or the tension that created within sort of the organization's longstanding members happened a couple of years ago. In some ways, I feel like I have kind of benefited from the storm, the storm that kicked up really went on for a couple of years. And I think now, to be honest, too, the culture changes around a plan like that, and it doesn't quite feel to many longtime members as radical as it felt maybe two and a half years ago. So in some ways, I feel like I've kind of walked in after some of that storm kind of has kicked up and is now in some ways feels like it's subsiding a little bit.
Yeah, I would say, fortunately for API HIP, there's a lot of trust in some modernization and new perspectives. Like I mentioned, I'm relatively young even from when I was a board member, and letting me be the executive director, I think there was a lot of trust in that I would bring in those new perspectives. But I've definitely been on boards and other organizations that have a harder time doing that. And, sometimes it just takes like a hard conversation, like looking at dwindling numbers or low fundraising or missed opportunities and say like, well, those could be a result of our refusal to try new things, utilize new tools, engage new audiences, right? And that's what I try to think back to, but it's hard not to frame it in like an ultimatum to your senior board members, right? Where it's like you have to frame it in a right way and present them with data and correlation, right?
It's a delicate dance. In terms of that, I also think I can't necessarily chime in on this question I asked myself, but I will throw out that I think, again, just this idea of change is good. And one thing that when our longtime leader, again, I know Jenny, yours was there 21 years? So Linda Dishman at the Conservancy was with us for 31 years. Which is a long time to be at an organization. And in some ways, the organization kind of taken on the identity of Linda. And that was like, how do you extract that and, move forward? And that's not uncommon with a lot of preservation organizations. Certainly, I think we've seen a change in leadership for a lot of those within the last 5-10 years. And that's part of the challenge with the new ED stepping into that role. But the other thing that we took advantage of with her leaving was that we had always had on our strategic plan goal to establish an endowed fund to be able to provide grants to support preservation projects throughout the county. And this was an impetus to be able to, one, honor her legacy at the organization by fundraising to actually establish that fund. And we're very close to meeting our $1 million goal for that, which has been great in terms of that. So I think it's also, there's change that comes with new leadership, but also the change with the past leadership, and how do you use that in terms of an opportunity as well. And also with all of us being new, there's new opportunities that come with that too, in terms of how we frame that within our organization and our communities as well. So I'm looking at another question is, how do we engage younger generations, younger members, younger folks in terms of wanting to be engaged in the work that we do, since we tend to skew older in terms of, as we talked about membership before, but sometimes just our demographic that our supporters that tend to be with us are of a different generation. So maybe that's a good question for you. You're our youngest ED in the group here, so maybe you can give us some wisdom on that point.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because my staff that we recently hired are even younger than me, right? So in this role, I'm thinking a lot about working with Gen Z as they enter the workforce, as they engage with our content, attend our events, support our causes with their time and their resources. And so I think a lot of times when we have this kind of conversation, it's like, what do we need to do? And then the first answer is like, well, just ask them. And then the second thing that is often missed is like, well, then do, or at least try to do what they're asking for, right? Because it's like sometimes we hear things that we don't want as an answer, right? And we're like, oh, well, at least I asked. So it's like, well, you can't expect the result to follow up if there's not an action step, right? And so like a very easy anecdote that you guys might not want to hear, and maybe I didn't even want to hear, was we know that Facebook is dying, Instagram is middle of the pack, and then a lot of the content that Gen Zers and new audiences are on TikTok, right? And so we saw an increase of 1,000%, tenfold of our engagement from posting our daily API everyday educational content just from posting on TikTok compared to Instagram, right? And so those audiences intercross, and now we have that growing audience of like people engaging with our work that might not have otherwise if we stuck to like, well, we just want to do Instagram. We don't want to do the extra work of posting it to another site. Like, it's a hard conversation and you have to allocate time, resources, but like, if that is the answer that's coming across all your reports, all your articles that's saying like, this is where they are, you got to meet them where they are, right? So yeah, that's my rambly answer.
My question for you is, what's after TikTok so we can get ahead of that? Because it's a lot of investment to get on each one of these. So, but I hear what you're saying for sure in terms of that. Question about how much time do we spend on our fundraising as opposed to our other types of preservation work. And I think that will probably vary for all of us in lots of different ways in terms of the size of our organizations and how we distribute our workload. But getting some insights on that might be helpful here.
I mean, for me, I think it shifts depending on the time of year. We all just came off of end of year giving, so we probably were putting a lot of our time into fundraising. And things are starting to kind of, even out a little bit now. For Preserve Montana, I am the main fundraiser. We don't have any development staff right now. The board is starting to step up more to get more engaged with building relationships with donors and donor prospects. Some feel comfortable making asks, some not, but that's another resource that we can tap into. And some of my staff write grants too. But I guess if I had to put like a % of my time on fundraising, it's definitely at least 25%. I mean, I touch fundraising every day, pretty much that I'm in the office in some shape or form. So it's a pretty big piece for sure. If I had some development staff, maybe that would be different, and maybe that percent's not exactly accurate, but it's a pretty constant thing.
I was going to guess about the same number. I mean, of course, I've only been in for 3 months, but that's, yeah, that's sort of that was my approximate guess too, is about 25%.
Yeah, for us, it's kind of in flux, just like Jenny said, where it's not quite a percentage. And it's a lot of times chicken or the egg, right? Where it's like, do we do the programming and show how successful it is and ask for funding, or do we get the funding first so that we can implement it correctly from the start, right? And so we're always navigating that, and there's not a consistent answer.
Yeah, this question came up with our board when I was talking with them about this position, and I think it's really, you're in some ways you're spending 100% doing fundraising. In all honesty, in terms of it's always in your mind and thinking in these positions about the work that we do, either programmatically or specifically development work. Where is there a fundraising component to this to support the program and the organization? So I think that's part of it. At the Conservancy, we do have a development, department with 3 staff that is focused on events and grants and major gifts and planned giving and all kinds of things, which is great. But I kind of see all of us at the nonprofit, the entire staff as fundraisers. I'm not sure everyone sees them that way, but that's why I would like to kind of rethink and help people understand what the bottom line is the more money that we can bring in, help support our programs, we can grow and do more and be more impactful and meaningful in terms of the organization that we are. So that's probably not the most realistic 100%, but it's what I think we're often thinking about, and probably is what's keeping us up at night sometimes about, will we raise the bottom line in terms of that particular event or program that we're trying to hit for here. So I think we have time for maybe one other question, and I think it's really maybe a question for Jenny. So come off mute again. But it's a question, and you're the only one here that really is representing a rural perspective. So how is it being at a nonprofit rural historic preservation organization, in terms of the work that you're doing and all the things that we've talked about, how does that relate maybe to our experiences, or how is it in contrast?
Yeah, well, Montana, as you know, covers a lot of area and has one of the smallest populations in the country. We have 1.3 million people across the entire state, which, Adrian, how many people live in the city of Los Angeles alone?
A lot. I don't have the current numbers, but
More,
a lot.
yeah. So it is hard. The resources, both monetarily, people-wise, it does present a lot of different challenges. Even geographically, getting across the state to different projects to work with different communities is a struggle. I mean, you've got hours to get, to the east side of the state. So it does present some different approaches. And I think statewide organizations in general, I mean, when you're looking at the geography you cover, statewide just present a different kind of scenario, especially if you're working in much larger states. The one thing about rural preservation, though, is that there is a fair amount of interest and support in it in terms of that kind of equity perspective and making sure that rural communities aren't being forgotten about, that they're getting as much attention as urban or other areas of the country. So in some ways, rural preservation benefits from that kind of greater level of incentives or support from grants and other types of funding and just interest in general. But yeah, it can definitely be tough. I mean, I'll say the organization that I sat on the board of in Colorado was also in a rural community. It was a site-specific project, though. It was a historic theater that we were doing a major rehabilitation of, in a community of less than 5,000 people. But it was also surrounded by communities that had a great deal of wealth, a lot of tourism. So I think it's very situational when you talk about, rural and what's that impact on preservation. I think there are similar challenges in other places, different challenges, similar opportunities, different opportunities as well. But yeah, I mean, it's all challenging and engaging work. And I think there are a lot of good things that are coming out of rural areas. The one other thing I would say is coming from the city and county of Denver, where I worked for 5 years most previously or most immediately. There is still replicability of what's going on in urban areas and how it can be applied in rural areas too. And I think we often don't look at that closely enough, but especially when we're thinking about local policies or other tools, I think there are things that can be done in both places in very similar ways that can have good outcomes at the end of the day. So I don't know if I answered the question exactly correctly or what they were looking for. Just to say that there are different opportunities, different challenges, but there's also some similarities that you can draw between urban and rural areas as well.
Yep, thank you. And I think that's our cue that we're done. So thanks, everyone.
Great. So we just have a couple of closing things, just as a reminder as I wait for the slide to pop up. We will be sharing a recording of the session in a follow-up email via the email you use for registration. So keep an eye out from that. I also saw a bunch of, I have a bunch of links that the panelists share with me. They wanted me to pass along, so I'm going to do that as well in that follow-up email. But first, I wanted to tell you about our upcoming webinars that we have. The first one in February, on February 13th, which is part of the AACHF conversation series. And I hope you'll join us for that. We also have a government, our government relations team has put together a great panel on affordable housing. And then our first forum members only book talk, which will be with Rosa Lowinger and Elizabeth Lacius, talking about Rosa's book, Dwell Time. And if you're a forum member and you haven't yet gotten the link to register for that, email us at forum@savingplaces.org. And if you're not a forum member and you'd like to join, I'll make sure to include the join information in the follow-up email. We also have coming up on April 3rd and 4th, the Path Forward online symposium, which is focusing on how to mitigate and adapt to a changing climate. It's a 2-day symposium. We hope you'll join us. The information for that is also going to come in the follow-up email. And I will also try to quickly drop the links before this closes out, but I might not be able to. But just keep an eye out for that information in the follow-up email as well. And finally, thank you, everyone, our speakers, Samantha from MPPN, Rhonda, who's been on the back end sharing the slides, for coming today. And all of that information actually about the webinars is on this link that's on the slide. And you can contact us at forumonline@savingplaces or forum@savingplaces.org. Both emails work. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your week. It's so great to hear from everyone today. Bye.
Everyone.